thank you everyone for joining. We appreciate you being here. We hope that you are safe and healthy. And if you're in the Northeast, we hope that you are staying warm. My name is Robyn Rosenbaum, and I'm Senior Manager of Strategic Partnerships here at Bridge. And I'm super excited about introducing our guest. He's one of my favorite people. We have Albert Thompson, who is the Managing Director of Digital at Walton Isaacson. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I'm going to turn it over to him, and he's going to talk about his role and his organization.
Absolutely. So thank you, Robyn, and thank you to the entire Bridge team who allowed me to participate today in this webinar. So I hope that you find it insightful. Hopefully, have some nuggets and get takeaways. So, as she said, I'm the head of digital at the agency, Walton Isaacson, in a snapshot. We're a full-service agency. Do a decent amount of multicultural. So I will get into some of that context as the conversation. But obviously, my ultimate job is really looking at how we leverage technology, the various platforms, to really pursue consumer audiences on behalf of our clients and the brands that they represent. So I hope that's enough, but I think as we get into the dialogue, I'll get into some aspects as to what we're tasked with sort of day-to-day, in particular when we talk all things automotive.
Awesome. So let's talk about why we are here. We're going to be talking about the changing environment and the current world that we're living in, and really how to reach those auto buyers in a pandemic world. So 2020 was a crazy year, to say the least, kind of a hot mess. We're all still dealing with all of the moving parts, right? People are moving, people are relocating, and there really are two types of consumers. There are people that want that interaction approach and still want to go into the dealership, but then you have folks that also want that contactless approach. And at the onset of COVID, we saw that auto sales did plummet by 47%. So Al, can you talk us through what your clients experienced last year?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you looked at was, the outset was what people were hoping for, this sort of V-shaped curve where things went to a ground stop, because I think everybody had to figure out the COVID dynamics, whether we're talking about nationally, regionally, market by market. It really depended on what the provisions were, almost municipality by municipality. So our client Lexus had, dealers that were open and some were closed, and some of that configuration was even different in a given city. And then some of it, there were just certain regions where COVID was much heavier, where, essentially the stores were closed. Some were appointment only. So the notion was like, look, everything kind of has to taper down. We made some media pivots in terms of investments. We had to turn things off as many advertisers. And then there was this notion that, look, once things would settle, and some of that was normalizing, not even so much about COVID going away, but the notion that this would be a V-shape. It would come down to a baseline and then return with a surge. And a lot of this was actually modeled based on what was happening in other countries, in particular China, who had obviously had the first outbreak of the COVID strand, but had started to understand what recovery would look like. So this is obviously merchandised as a narrative to pretty much all the manufacturers stateside. And, as you can see in terms of where you saw the recovery to what became a record quarter, everything did return in that V shape. I think the biggest thing people worried about is it being a U shape, where it's a slow decline, it flatlines, it stays there for an unbeknownst amount of time, and then it gradually trends up. So fortunate, obviously, for the business of automotive, it was that V shape they were hoping for, and that had a lot to do with the return in sales growth and volume as we closed out 2020.
Yeah, and we can see that in the chart right here, right? In April, there were 700,000 units sold, and December, there was 1.6. So the optimism in the auto industry, but really in the economy as a whole, is there. And it is so interesting how it's very different state by state and city by city. The rules are so different. So everyone is trying to adapt to all of the markets going on nationally. And we have to understand how can we account for the change in the consumer behavior from state by state too. That's something to take into consideration as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We did see some different trends where different regions had a recovery that was faster based upon level of restrictions or not. We even saw cities within the same state, in particular, some of the single point dealer markets recover faster, or that had really a continuation of foot traffic even through COVID, based upon the fact that where they were located, COVID counts were low, so they were able to maintain a certain level of operating. So as you can imagine, as you kind of opened, it was a hot mess, a bit of manual sorting it out. Luckily, everybody got back to a point where everybody could return to full store operations. But you really have to start to make pivots as a business to who can continue to fill the sales funnel based upon the ability to have customer contact, and almost start shifting priority, inventory to those regions so that they can make up for lost ground.
Right, exactly. And one of the biggest successes for 2020 was Tesla. So if anyone on the call, or Al, if you own the Tesla stock, kudos to you, because it shot up so much. So that's great to hear. But really, they have seen so much success in 2020. They're continuing to grow, and it's really like, why, right? Like, they have that contactless buyer, they have the brand loyalty. Why is Tesla so successful? Is it the types of vehicles? Is it because they care about the environment and they have those electric vehicles? Is it because more millennials are purchasing? It's not just about the luxury automobile. So, like, what can we learn from the Tesla model?
Yeah, it's a great example because the factors are more than just a hybrid story. Because hybrid technology has been around. Toyota Motor Corp was one of the first in the business and really sort of empowering hybrid technology. You even now see that involved in motorsports. Tesla represents a lot of the Tesla success is about what it doesn't represent. It's the not car company, meaning it's not gas related, it's not dealership related. It's the anti-car company's brand. And look, there are a lot of brands that could win based on who they are not, less the likeness of who they are. And that's a factor. Yes, it is a bit of a millennial's choice. So in their generation of the car company, Tesla is more or less representative of what embodies who they are as millennials. So they're obviously digital first, tech savvy. That's a lot of the representation in the core product. And look, it's not that other makes don't have it. It's very much that that's essentially what they stand for. They already have the contactless buyer model, so it really didn't matter that you couldn't go to a store, because the only place you were going to was a shopping mall just to see feature sets and maybe one model posted on the floor. So their framework of presence in market, and mind you, they don't really do any advertising. They just kind of exist. They already had a framework for success that if there was a lockdown, because the consumers very much, I go pick out my feature set, and then the car magically arrives and is delivered to me. So they really had I would say, a strategic advantage, because they weren't reliant on a supply chain system, retailers, wholesalers, to move product in which somebody had to get to a physical location. So that was, I think, a lesson just for the automotive industry as well, that model could flourish. It obviously has when you look at the numbers, because the sales volume is indicative of the stock trending, as you would see, as well as just the identifier that a younger generation of the future consumer, millennials, and I'd say younger Gen Xers, are looking for something essentially different beyond just the notion of hybrid. Look, they're also one of the first to really bring a high degree of styling to hybrid technology across their entire portfolio of product design. Very unique from a lot of the stuff you saw some of the other makes that the product was relatively ugly because it wasn't about that. They own that as well, and that is something that they found, that the consumer is unwilling to settle for mediocre design because it is hybrid or electric or what have you. They still want the same styling cues as some of the premium Japanese and German brands, and that's something that they stumbled upon very early on in their product life cycle. And you see that there will obviously be a marketplace response to it, but they did, again, as a signal to the marketplace to be able to thrive during that particular time period. Did clearly make a statement in terms of what consumer choices are going to start to look like moving forward.
Yeah, it'll be so exciting to continue to watch Tesla and how they continue to evolve and adapt in the years to come. So, besides the newer vehicles, we also need to talk about the used vehicle, right? Like new versus used. There are different buyer profiles, different buyer behaviors. And in the fast growing digital used car retailer space, we have companies like Carvana and Vroom. And those are the ones that are really taking advantage of this vacuum and making it easy, specifically for those budget constrained consumers to find the car they want. And I didn't go through Carvana, but speaking from my own personal experience, I purchased a vehicle in September of 2020, and I did an online contactless approach. They drove it right to my doorstep. It took 5-10 minutes. I signed on the dotted line and I drove off into the sunset. So what types of things can we learn from Carvana and these types of organizations when it comes to the used car inventory?
Yeah, I think, much of the automotive industry had always been kind of beholden to the auto endemic sites. And, I don't want to call it a necessary evil, but necessary to advertise across their platforms, from car gurus to autotrader.com, you get into cars.com. I mean, the auto endemic journey is just part of the decision making process. The same way when you think about Edmunds and KBB and even the auto enthusiast sites. I think what emerged as a rather hokey strategy, vehicles in a vending machine like you're buying candy, wasn't taken as seriously. I mean, it was a very interesting novelty. The question is, would it stay? But the reality of it is, it still speaks to a similar notion in the pre-owned market about what a consumer is willing to go through in terms of their path to purchase, where they're from initial interest to product delivery. I mean, look, we're in an Amazon model. Everything is click to buy. And the notion of getting Amazoned is almost that Carvana takes a similar approach and saying, look, create an engine, highly curates what you're looking for based on your preferences, sources it nationally, gets it to a place, shows up in a major glass tower, you press the button, car comes down, game over. So, the idea is that's a very unusual model for automotive that's been heavily reliant on the dealership experience. And there's nothing wrong with the equity that's in place there. It's the simple understanding that there's a consumer who's less vested in that because that's not a world they've grown up in. And when you start to look at the presence that for which they are able to operate under, meaning they don't need the same land masses as CarMax, where you have acres and acres of cars, and still find a successful model, points to yet another consumer type. And I think that's the biggest thing to take note of with Carvana is a consumer type. Because again, if that's emerging, people will have similar expectations from other brands. Now, there is a distinction between the stuff I work on pre-owned that has, the certified stamp of Lexus, and obviously the other makes have the same thing. That it is not the same in terms of what comes down from Carvana. But again, that's also a different pre-owned buyer, someone who's willing to just buy a used car that's in certain condition, and versus someone who wants something that is certified from the dealership. The way I look at it, because all dealers carry non-certified product, is it's yet another consumer profile type, and as well as another delivery stream. So all this needs to be taken note, because if the ascent of Carvana continues to grow, it's less about the Carvana success. It's more about, well, how many other hundreds of thousands of millions of consumers would take their car procured this way and bypass what has been the typical consumer flow of needing to show up at a physical retail location to test drive and go through the approach of looking at a car. The other thing it signifies is there's a high level of confidence in a contactless buyer, in the sense that they don't feel the need to become one with the car in a test drive before buying. And if that becomes a mainstay expectation, that changes the formula of going to market.
Yeah, it's great. And that leads us right into the next slide here when we're drilling down into the two types of target consumers, right? We have the dealers, we have people that really still want that face-to-face interaction in a mask, of course. And then we have the contactless buyer. So it's really, how do we drill down and understand our targeted consumer and that buyer profile, and how can we really measure buyer intent with these two types of profiles, but also with new segments approaching, right? People are moving, they're relocating, they're moving from these bigger metropolitan cities to a smaller scale city. Some people are even moving in with family. Maybe their discretionary income is going up. I mean, there are people that obviously have been very affected by COVID, but some people have more discretionary income now than they did before. So how can we identify who truly has buyer intent?
Yeah, I think you have to look at monitoring both pathways because there's clearly a mature consumer who's used to coming to the dealership experience. And part of the surge in growth was pent up demand. That's what really fueled that V shape, really climbing to that ascent, in crossing the million mark in total units sold that we showed in the earlier slide. And then there's the contactless buyer who, look, some of the younger generation, they're just not interested in the dealership experience. Look, they've already heard from their parents. They know what it's about. They're not interested. They're like, look, let me just click my preferences like I'm an Amazon Prime member and then get the product delivered to me. The other thing you have to consider is the difference in types of products. When I look at Lexus, I look at the RX and the ES that have, a long history of equity. It could be that I could be a contactless buyer because I already know the engineering behind those cars, in particular if I'm just renewing. So if someone's coming out of lease and just wants the next model, I don't need to come in. Just make it easy. Let me sign. Let me get the car. I already know the upgraded feature set. And then it may be for a brand new model that's launched or a major update, I got to come in because I really got to check it out. I got to lay eyes on it. I got to see the differences in previous iterations or versus the other things I've laid eyes on from a competitive standpoint. And thus, I need to have the test drive experience. So right now, the jury's sort of out. Is it a generational split between boomers, older Gen Xers, still understand and value the dealership experience, and the younger generation wanting to really sort of only do it in a contactless manner? It'd be very interesting to see for Gen Z, who's under the millennials, to see where they sort of net out here, because I think they're going to be kind of the deciding factor. But you may find the difference in the dealership buyer versus the contactless buyer being based on model preference. I mean, the average guy buying a supercar or hypercar isn't test driving it. When you're talking about $500,000, $1 million car, it's getting dropped off. I mean, so, again, it'd be incumbent upon unpacking the preferences, and is it at the model level? Is it at the audience segment? Is there a cross section to really discern to what degree you should be driving media to people at the store level versus tracking their digital journey of online leads? Because by and large, they want to have at least a more of a contactless experience. It may not be 100%, but it may be more. Let me stick in my digital journey, e-DocuSign, and then we can meet up, and then that cuts out part of the physical store experience process.
Yeah, I like the point that you made about if someone is already in a specific model and they just need to upgrade to the next model, they know that they want it, they do lean towards that contactless approach. Speaking from experience, that's what I did. I had the previous model of the car that I purchased in September, so I knew that the next model up was exactly the same. But if I had decided to go into a different brand or a different model, I most likely would have had to go to the dealer to test drive a vehicle, because that's just how I think. I'm not going to go and buy a vehicle without test driving it. So there are so many factors to take into consideration, and it's just so fascinating. And when we talk about the sales that we saw in December of 2020, there were over 300 vehicles from people to choose from, yet 15 models really accounted for almost all of those sales. So with all of the endless options for the consumers, how do we make it easy for someone and their customer journey and identify who really has interest in what type of vehicle?
Yeah, I mean, we saw this coming competitively, where there's just buyer fatigue. There's so many options, there's so many variants, there's so many levels of almost the same platform. And you see just range from an SUV standpoint, and that's largely where a lot of the expansion has been, because the sedan market is contracted. But look, it's a lot to sift through. So the purchase or recurrent purchase patterns of a familiar and trusted nameplate really counts. The notion that the curve is set by a core 15, not surprising. I mean, we can rattle some of those off. We know what those cars are. But it's the gateway from there for which then people go to. Because what they don't stay is in that necessarily same core 15. It may be laddering up. They started in one model, and then when they migrate out, they consider a series of models. We see that a lot of in our growth for multicultural, where a lot of the consumers come out of non-luxury, which has a pretty robust cadence. When they move into luxury, obviously it contracts. So it really starts to refine itself in terms of options. But these are all the things you essentially have to take into account. The other thing is our multicultural consumer considers more cars as they get closer to buying. So it may be 2 models out when they're a year out. When they get into 30, 69 days, it goes to 4 or 5, depending if we're talking about in particular Black or Hispanic. So when you start to consider that notion that more product is considered the closer they get to making a decision, to be very, very conscious about that, very intentional in understanding what your model cadence should be to this particular consumer. I mean, you really have to dig into the details of buyer patterns. You got to look at conquest and defection. So what is the inflow? And then why do you lose them? And when you lose them, what do you lose them to? You really have to sort of a defense strategy because there essentially are so many options. And, you see patterns where even when people defect from brands, there's a couple brands that everyone kind of goes to test out for the first time. In just because there's been a resurgence around that brand, the styling nameplate is improved. So there's a lot of information, as you can imagine, really synthesized to ensure some, a high level degree of retention and loyalty. You also have to dig into what cars have the greatest retention and loyalty versus not, and what consumer segments do as well. We know our Black consumer offhand has some of the highest retention of any of the segments out there you can pursue. But it's things like that that really help you sort of build a business strategy around where you should be focusing on in sort of the next move as you go to market.
Yeah. And Al, with everything that we discussed and the erosion, if you will, of the middle class, how can we identify and set up our segments, and specifically multicultural, because that's what Walton is specific in? How do we go about setting up those segments and getting super granular to identify those individuals?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, a lot have been talking about the erosion of the middle class in this country, but not as pertains to the middle class product consumption. Because with that class contracting, meaning people either have more money or less money, that's just the world we seem to be accelerating in, and COVID didn't help that. It really created a divide between have and have nots. You've seen a bigger race to the bottom, and a race to the bottom is me stating that, hey, Kia is probably the discount automotive manufacturer that sort of won that conversation to some degree as a brand nameplate. I'm not saying that that's what everybody wants to own, but that's definitely a place that they've carved out with what I call a business advantage. But when you talk to automakers, in particular non-luxury level, where it's selling, it's entry level and it's a base model entry level, because there are a whole lot of new buyers who just needed cars because they didn't want to ride share. They needed a vehicle as a sanctuary to get out of the homes because we're all during lockdown. But when you start to look at those patterns, which you have to study, you have to think about and start to hypothesize, okay, what's next? If more is coming into non-luxury and more is going into prestige, vehicles cost 100K plus, and again, that tracks to that have and have nots. What does that mean for the middleware? Is it that product needs to move upstream or downstream? So the need to unpack those data signals, which I'm sure we'll get into, becomes even more paramount in understanding. Does that mean your targeting now has to be against audiences with lower household income than you thought before? Like, you need to lower your thresholds. Does that mean that product that perhaps had a little heavier price tag now is in vogue because prestige is growing? And that's one of the things we've seen with the Lexus GX. I mean, it's on fire pretty much across the country. I personally have owned 4, so I can attest to the value of the product. But when you start to look at the prestige SUV market going up, fueled by some of the exotics like Lamborghini introducing an SUV, Bentley, Bugatti, Rolls-Royce, then that's kind of the rising tide lifts all boats. So you see the stratosphere of more expensive vehicles increasing in sales volume, thus changing manufacturing as a structure. And then you see the entry level becoming a bigger conversation. Part of the reason that we've been focusing as much on the IS launch as well as the UX SUV. So again, all of those things are very important in looking at. And look, all you have to do is start to look at human buying behavior, because as you talk about people like yourself relocating out of New York to Texas for the sake of affordability, that now changes your automotive structure. One, there's certain things you would consider buying that you would never buy being in Manhattan. But there's also a level of disposable income that now is freed up because you're not paying New York rent. All those shifts speak to shifts in regionality, and maybe their importance are less of or more than they were before. And some of that migration has to be studied in context of the contracting middle class. And look, if a lot of the middle class, migrated out of the expensive cities, they all of a sudden have more discretionary income to spend more in that middle class range of product consumption in particular vehicles. But again, obviously, there's a lot to unpack in kind of that narrative and what that really means. The idea is starting to pay attention to that now as signals to what it's going to mean for the future.
Yeah. And while I've been in Texas, there are so many Teslas here. It is unbelievable. It's Tesla Nation. And there's so many cars from California. So there's tons of people migrating in. So it's cool to see all of that actually evolve right in front of my face. So when we're talking about understanding the data signals across the journey and finding customers and knowing how to attract them, there are some signals that we can use when we're identifying these people. So for instance, if we know that someone already has a Honda, because we can identify that. We know that they have an affinity towards the Honda brand and they're currently financing that Honda. We also know that Bank of America is in charge of that finance, right? So if we can say, hey, this person has Bank of America app downloaded on their phone, they have an affinity towards Honda, they're currently in a Honda, we can make those one-to-one correlations. So there are those offline and online and mobile signals that we can use to identify these individuals.
Absolutely. And look, from our conversations, even with the Bridge team, we've been very attentive to making sure certain data signals are turned on. And the machine is almost, I don't want to say over engineered, but there's a lot of inputs about the audience beyond the multicultural setup and framework. And again, there's certain variables we have to manage, like looking at, changes around household income structures. But we know from conquest and defection brands we do very well against, and we make sure that we're in front of people who own those products, because when they leave non-luxury, and obviously if they're not in Toyota, we want them to see Lexus as a first option. We look at the auto endemic journey, so your Edmunds, your KBBs, and other ones I pointed through between all your new and used car sales, your enthusiast sites. We know that's just part of the decision-making model. So as we unpack this and really share data from different partners, it's really about layering up campaigns to find people who have the strongest intent to buy that brand. And obviously, in the case of us, it's the Lexus brand. There are just people who have very defined automotive tastes that will exclude them from ever buying. And look, those are things that you may never know. But those are things you need to be conscious of, that from a human factor, they just flat out exist. So we tend to try to be very intentional about who we are going after and what consumer type is winnable, and not waste, inventory and client advertising dollars on audiences that we may not have the best interest in pursuing those every day.
Yeah. So that's it for our fireside chat. I even had a candle to set the mood behind us. So I know that we do have some questions from folks and they are trickling in. So I do want to address those. So the first question that we have, so for our partners, and you are one of our partners, it's not just about delivering impressions, right? It's being smarter, it's being more strategic. What is paramount from a partner's perspective for auto?
Yeah, and I wouldn't even apply just auto in every category, obviously, for this conversation. Our partners have to do more than deliver impressions. That's an overrated notion. You have to be teaching us something about the consumer we're pursuing while delivering against the campaign. Otherwise, we cannot operationalize the information to take action. In particular, to merchandise, even in other conversations beyond programmatic. So look, a lot of the information based upon how campaigns is set up, we may use in planning meetings. We may use in the model mix strategy. We may use it in model cadence. We may use it in breaking apart different audience segments of how we should pursue them. And obviously for multicultural, that's something you have to be very intentional about continuously. So for us, we look at partners who can set up campaigns in a way to teach us X about a particular consumer that we're using. It has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of our targeting is search enhanced, because search is a great measure of intent. So we're looking at people who have hand raised first. We can even develop different segments that way. But all of these things matter. Is it all ladders up to a bigger narrative, or is just relevant to media being spent in other channels?
Mm-hmm. So the next question is from Joshua, and he says, I have a dealer that tells me online buyers always overestimate their credit profile / down payment or payment estimates, and most of the dealer profit is made in a person's financing with warranties and upgrades. So if you could speak to that and maybe provide some color for Josh.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate it, Josh. Look, the finance conversation is always an interesting dynamic because the biggest thing that certain brands deal with is credit worthiness. In particular, when you're in the luxury space, obviously Lexus is akin to, look, you have to have a certain credit worthiness to afford a reasonable payment or a competitive payment. And that's essentially sort of part of it. A lot of it starts on the conquesting end. We've had conversations with dealers saying, hey, we appreciate the opportunity to expand the reach, but we don't want more bad prospects. Look, salespeople want the best prospects and they want qualified leads. In particular, those that are qualified based on conversation, meaning they've leaned in, they're very essentially serious about it. I think, there has to be education at the dealer level on that sort of sliding scale in terms of it. Look, that's not always available on dealer sites, not even necessarily the manufacturer sites. Because look, they're trying to get you into the full lower funnel to negotiate. In other words, they don't want to scare you off. But platforms like TrueCar really sort of set the stage for what a vehicle is really worth. I mean, there's so much information out there now that the consumer is able to do the research and really understand what they qualify for. But look, if you're using those basic calculators online, look, they're not 100% accurate to what Lexus Financial Services deems as a higher value prospect based on credit worthiness. So that is always going to be a bit of a dance. But I think at the store level, the dealer should have compartmentalized the range of possibility based on the history of all the different buyers that have come in the fold. They should almost have it as a book and saying, hey, based on people who have your score rating and based on your level household income, et cetera, collateral, what have you, network, whatever the other qualifiers are. This is what you're looking at based on the product range, because a lot of that has to do why people choose one car over the other when they came in for one, just because the incentive structure is better. Lexus has seen that with some of the sedans, ES versus IS. They've seen it with some of their SUVs where, look, one is running a better incentive, so you're going to get a better deal for that particular month. So it's really hard to land the plane in an exact science. But those are just all the variables that the consumer needs to be aware of going in, and that the dealer can do from an education standpoint to explain what their options are once they hit the storefront.
Awesome. I'm sure Josh appreciates all of that information. There's another comment when someone really wants us to dig into the data signals and drill down into the target segments, but also the findings that we're learning from all of our digital campaigns and the attribution. Advertisers and dealers, everyone's becoming smarter and everyone wants more information on their consumers. So how can we drill down into the data points that we're understanding about these people and how they're engaging?
Absolutely. Great question. I think the first thing is when you work with any partner, you have to figure out how the reporting can be separated. And look, at a lot of our partners, we have different audience segments. And I'll say, hey, I need the reporting broken down by these three segments and these three segments. And look, that's absent the model. That's within the model level of targeting. So if I want to know if someone is, I'm speaking off the cuff, a Toyota intender versus a non-luxury intender versus a luxury intender versus a Lexus intender. And I hate the word intender, but we'll use it for this discussion. Then I want to see where I'm getting more or stronger response. Stronger response rates, stronger response, stronger conversions, stronger test drives. Really got to parse that out. I really get to this notion of looking at attribution in the digital and physical journey. Like all our partners have, for the most part, store visit tracking if they're tied to if they're running mobile campaigns. We're moving to a place where we're going to wire that up through our connected TV targeting, our digital audio targeting, and our paid social targeting. So while they will drive clicks to a destination where we can measure site reactions, we will also measure footfall and what that volume is. And we'll look at that by model, as well as by some of those individual reporting segments that I noted before. And you have to start to look at patterns and trends. Now, obviously, you need to spend budget to a statistical relevance. You have to decide that on your own. And you have to spend it over time. And you have to run a variation of model mixes. And you have to run across a series of different promotions. So it's different between running the L-certified campaigns versus sales event versus new car versus whatever manufacturer has essentially going on, to start to look at the behaviors. And look, this is the science we've sort of broken down over years. So this is not something you're going to necessarily learn in a quarter, but patterns will start to emerge. And then you can start to put together strategic conversations that make sense. But My thing is measure as much as you can and make sure the reporting has a breakdown to literally be able to look at it, to be able to decipher what can deliver against what. We're very big on this channel strategy can deliver against X, but not that. And we don't ask channels to accomplish what they can't. Then we even share information from one partner to another partner as learning. I mean, that's typically uncustomary, but we'll take search insights and share it with a mobile or connect TV partner to understand, like, look, from a search perspective, this is what's tracking strongest against the brand. Look, we do this beyond automotive. So take this into consideration in your targeting parameters across this channel, because search has value as a strong measure of intent still. So it's about how do you get search insights beyond the search box and apply it to other tactics and then measure that and then see what the difference is. So we've done that as well. So I think, look, it's work. There's no question, but I think that you have to have a high level of curiosity around discovery. And I think that's what's absent, that curiosity around discovery and learning.
Yeah. And just to repeat back to you what you're saying, it really is that multi-channel approach, right? Like reaching the same consumers across multiple channels and multiple devices and understanding where they are and their behavior. And connected TV is something that we've seen an uptick in since the pandemic, because people are home, they're streaming more content. So that's something that's really important to note, but it's understanding and taking the learnings from each channel and then applying those learnings to the next 90 days or the next 30 days of the campaign.
Yeah, it's a great thing you brought that up, not too much connected TV. Each of the consumer segments or based on the model type can have a very different behavior. One of the things I talked about in the podcast was this notion of signaling, that the younger generation, in particular Gen Z, but a bit of millennials as well, they do what's called signaling, meaning when they see something in advertising, they don't go to Google. I mean, I have to tell my kids repeatedly, like they're in high school, like, just go to Google. Like what they're doing is they're sifting through their social feeds. They're trying to see, is it signaling? Is anyone talking about it? What's the chatter? So they go from TikTok to Snap to YouTube. And if nobody's discussing it, it's not a thing in their mind. Like it almost doesn't exist. That's a very different behavior than boomers or Gen Xers who go do kind of the empirical research style. I'll go to Wikipedia, I'll go to Google, I'll look it up, I'll go on the manufacturer sites, boom, 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 boom. So you have to think about how different generations discover information. So part of the channel strategy may be because that buyer is not, you're not going to reach them in this channel. That's not what they do. Or they're unwilling to make a purchase decision based on exposure in that channel. So you really have to get into the usage of the channels and how each of the audience segments use different channels. And are they in a frame of mind to receive a marketer's message by the category? Really got to get into those sort of rules of engagements because it's not universal. So I know there's a lot of talk about cross-channel, but some of it is just that, and one of the things that will come out in the research later is that heavy TikTok users don't have Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest profiles per se. It's not like they're on all of them. They literally don't have those. So it's kind of like if you want to reach them, the younger generation in a social perspective, it's almost TikTok or nothing. And again, all of this is evolving, but you have to get down into the audience science to understand what the implications are.
Yeah, it's all about the audience. So we are at time. I personally have learned so much. So thank you so much for your time. I'm sure all of our attendees have as well. One last note for everyone that's on the call. Everyone will be receiving an email with the presentation, a video recording, and other premium marketing materials around auto intender. So thank you for joining us and have a good one. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, all.